Hello, John. How are you?
I am good. How are you?
I'm okay, thank you. Peachy.
Your top is very cute.
Oh, thank you. Well,
The
for those of you who are listening, then you're missing out.
Yeah, you're missing out. The buttons that are right at the edge of the arms and the shoulder there almost kind of remind me of like suspenders, but they don't actually go up over the shoulders. It's just
No,
like a pattern there, but it
right.
almost kind of reminds me of suspenders. And I could see this as I don't know, it could go a lot of different directions because I can't see anything else, but I could totally put a sailor hat on you at the moment
There
and
you
it would
go.
fit.
It's very French, right?
Yeah, yeah, it would totally, yeah, it would fit with any of those styles of hats. But for whatever reason, like sailor was the first thing that came to mind. But I like it. It's
There's
cute.
thank you. There's something very French about sailor stripes, t-shirts, and shirts, right? We
Yeah.
love that for some reason. I'm not sure why, but it's a very popular thing in
It's a
style in
hey,
France.
there you go. Whatever works. That's
Yeah.
all good. Um,
So what are we
so
talking about today?
well, this is a for anybody who has listened to the main segment episode number 146 that just came out on Monday. Date wise would have been February 7th of 2022. That episode was the Natural Beekeeping Corner Part 10, and it was an interview between Nathalie and Mr. James Lee,
Mhm.
and they get into some interesting conversation and topics, but the overarching theme of it kind of hits on a few bullet points. For instance, bias amongst beekeepers, biased in general, but we're going to try to focus this on beekeeping in general. But bias, dissonance, different cognitive type things there, how it can relate, empathy, being able to empathize with another beekeeper to maybe build up a little bit of tolerance on
That's
the
right.
differences between practices and stuff. So we're going to kind of bridge that episode over into just a general conversation, not necessarily following the specific subject matter, but using it as a jumping off point and go through and kind of see where that leads us. And
Good.
one of the things in there that is kind of the bigger point about like the tolerance and the differences and having a bias can be anything. Bias can be when you first started beekeeping, whoever taught you the style that they prefer because they have a bias towards
Mhm.
that style. Nathalie may have a bias, you could say, towards top
No,
bars
no, I don't. Or natural treatment free
or
beekeeping.
natural treatment free beekeeping. So we all have our bias, and that's one of the things that whenever I say like beekeeping is beekeeping, the container that the bees are in doesn't necessarily matter so much. If you started with a top bar, that's going to be what's most natural to you. If you started with a Warray, same thing. Langstroth, same thing. So it's all kind of just a matter of perspective. It doesn't mean that we can't learn the other thing. But
Mhm.
one of the problems we find ourselves having is that we do create these bias and then we do not share the other opinions or options that are out there. And that's one of the things that on the main Hive Jive, I tried really hard, especially the first season and a half,
I noticed.
to not be biased about anything, to show you all the different options of beekeeping that you could possibly do, and to tell you there is no right or wrong answer. It's whatever fits your needs and desires best.
Mm.
But if you go to a beekeeping club, that's not the case,
There's a
and
there's a very heavy bias in a lot of the beekeeping clubs based on what the creators of the club or the people that are leading the club at the time or the majority of the beekeepers philosophy is, and that bias is very often not quite tolerant of other people's goals
no,
or styles.
no. So this is an off subject thing. And I think that at this point you have gotten your feet wet enough that you might have already started seeing some little glimmers of this, but maybe not. It's early in the year.
Mhm.
But one of the things that just absolutely blew my mind about beekeeping as a group and a culture was the first time that I ever had to do anything legislative related with laws in the state of Texas specifically.
Right.
And all of a sudden, talk about something that can polarize people.
Mhm.
People that you had known and worked with and thought that you were on the same page suddenly turned into strangers that you had never talked to before,
Yeah.
and you had no idea where this perspective and point of view was coming from, and everybody was against everybody and they were all lashing out. But the weird thing was what was trying to be accomplished was for the betterment of everybody, and both parties agreed in their own verbiage, this is the bigger catch here, is in their own way of saying it, they both agreed on what needed to be done, but they couldn't agree on how to do it. And partly they didn't like that the other person was going to do it, or vice versa. Like, it was very strange to see how polarizing it was. And it was almost disconcerting, or like a big disconnect that you suddenly see within this group of this community, because up to that point, oh my God, you're a beekeeper, I'm a beekeeper, that's so awesome, we both
I
keep
love
bees,
you. We love each other. We love
got
our
all,
bees.
yeah, we got all these things in common, you know. And then you start bringing up some of these other things, and it does get very, very polarizing. But that was the apex, that was the peak of what I experienced. But you can dial that down greatly to like what you guys were talking about, the difference between treatment and treatment free.
Right.
And that is a very polarizing statement.
I was going to say that's not dialing it down at all.
Well, from the legit,
Right.
the legislative, you know,
Right,
we're
right,
changing
right.
your laws, dialing it down from that.
Mhm.
Treatment versus treatment free can be very polarizing, but at the same time, it is still beekeeping. And in your synopsis that you put out there for the episode, you had a statement in there about how the fears of, just because somebody else's goals and fears do not line up with your own goals and fears does not mean that they are wrong.
Right.
You're in different places, you have different things going on. One of the things that came to mind when I was listening to part of it was, you talked about how when somebody first gets into beekeeping and they're new to it, they kind of get overwhelmed with some of these fears that are instilled on them by their local club or by whatever they have used to kind of get their feet wet in beekeeping.
Mhm.
And one of those fears is something that's come up in the podcast before, where I just started beekeeping. I only have one hive, and they're overloaded with mites. They're going to die. I've got my person that gave me the bees is natural, and they're saying, do not do anything, don't treat them. But I spent a lot of money on them and I don't want to lose them. What do I do? You know,
Mhm.
and you can find yourself stuck in those situations where, are you choosing the lesser of the two evils? What's truly right? What's not, you know? And is that a great first impression for somebody to have, to spend, you know, $500 on bees and lose them because somebody else said you absolutely cannot do this, or you absolutely must do that, you know, like regardless which direction it is.
Well, first of all, I mean, I would be weary of anybody telling you you can absolutely not do this or do that, or this is impossible, or anything like that. First of all, somebody tells me I cannot do something, I'm going to do it, and not only once, but I'm
Just
going to
in
do it
spite.
twice, because I'm just going to show them that I can do it. That's neither here nor there, though. I was going to say that we all have different goals. We all have different philosophies, but I think in the end, we all care about our animals, or for the most part, making sure that they stay alive at the very least. Not necessarily, you know, there's various degrees of caring about their well-being, but we all want them to stay alive. First of all, because it is a financial investment when you're buying them, or even if you've worked hard to maintain bees that you've gotten from catching swarms or anything. You have equipment, you have all kinds of time and work that you put into there, and all kinds of expectations that you want out of them. So if you're not caring for them the right way, they very easily die. Now, that's about an average of what, 30, 40, 45% across the board every year that people lose their colonies. That's huge. In nature, I think it's important to remember, first of all, that those fears, while being justified, they also don't really match what happens in nature, because in nature, a first year colony, the risk of failure is about 70%, right? And colonies die in nature, you know. So I'm not quite sure that when we keep them, we are doing them worse than they would in nature to start with. The other thing is that depending on the scale and also the goals for production or just pleasure, you might not have the same importance on your bees surviving or not. If you are a brand new beekeeper that's purchased bees, and this is very expensive and it's getting more and more expensive, you probably don't want to lose them. The paradox here is that if you buy only one colony, then you're actually risking their lives a lot more than if you bought 2 or 3 or even 4 colonies. And I know it's expensive, but if you're going to do that, I would recommend everybody buys at least 2 colonies, or starts with 2 colonies, so that they can help share resources and troubleshoot more easily. But honestly, if you can't afford it, I would say start with 3 or 4. It's not that much more work, and your chances of keeping them alive or getting into the next season with the same amount, if not more colonies, is much higher. Um, but those fears, like you said, we all have them. We don't want to lose our bees.
Yeah,
We
there's an
just
emotional attachment there as well. Not only just a financial investment, but a lot of times an emotional investment as well, because some of these colonies, you guys mentioned in the show different organizations, and one of those being like Hives for Heroes.
Mhm.
Some of these colonies are people's lifeline. It is their saving grace about being able to get out of their head and do something that is beyond themselves to help them kind of focus and calm down and stay sane in a way.
There's some
So
mindfulness to it, right? And you can be present in the now and just kind of it's almost meditative, and it's healing because of it. And you invest yourself emotionally in it, and if you lose it, then maybe you might, it's something very delicate. You want to do it right. When you're doing it for that purpose, you want to make sure that the chances of the colony doing well are higher, because if it fails, that might transfer into a feeling of failure
right.
in a way, which we all have experienced as beekeepers. We all have had, if you're 2 years into beekeeping, you've killed colonies. And that is very devastating. And it takes a while to realize that we're not perfect, we do our best, and we're trying, and it might not always work. Not all colonies of bees are meant to survive. My big philosophy and my bias, and actually my experience, is that if you're going to treat them, they're not necessarily going to be surviving more, and so you just kind of stick with it and do what you think is best. In my opinion, I don't want to subject my emotional attachment to my bees is to their well-being. Somebody that's commercial might not be attached as emotionally to a colony, to the colonies that they have. It's more a means to an end, to make a living, to make a profit, right? So they're not looking at it the same way as I do. I do still make a living out of it, and I make a very good living out of it. But I look at their well-being as my, it's kind of like the feedlots and the grass-fed things, right? There's also that philosophy. Not everybody agrees with one or the other. So all that is at play when you're keeping bees, and all that needs to be understood. It doesn't mean we're wrong, because we're doing things different from the other ones, but it's not also because we think we're right, then the others are wrong.
Right.
Right. So that tolerance that you were mentioning there is very important. That empathy for their fears and their wanting to keep their colonies healthy needs to come at play, so that we can understand their very personal choices on how to keep their bees.
So this is a sidestep. This is kind of a hard jump in there, but when you go through and like you mentioned commercial beekeepers, and you mentioned even things like feed yards versus grass fed, and antibiotic or hormone free, things
Mhm.
like that when you're talking about meat and poultry production. But there's ways that people can cheat that. And you can have an animal that was raised on hormones and antibiotics, and then they take them off of that and they take them out of the feed yard, and they spend the last X amount of months of their life on grass pasture, and it gives time for that other stuff to leave their system. And then they will turn around and sell that as grass fed, grass raised, or antibiotic free, meaning it didn't have it at the time of processing. And
I am
unfortunately,
biting my tongue.
I
Don't
know.
you're talking.
So I'm gonna actually jump over here. I'm gonna make you read something that you read to me just a minute ago. Just that synopsis of the article. Commercial beekeepers, and kind of, we oftentimes lump things on commercial beekeepers because they may not have the best interest of the bees in mind in the forefront as so much as the dollar sign. A lot of times they will
They
get.
have it to the extent that they want to keep them alive so that they don't lose their shirt.
Right, exactly. But is it really that they're doing what they should for the bees? So in this article that you came across, and unfortunately this one is behind a paywall, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on it. So we're not going to share this, but I just want you to read that synopsis about what one of these commercial beekeepers had done to try to make efforts back in 2016 towards pesticides and chemical treatments.
Well, he's got 92, he did have in 2017, 92,000 colonies. I think he was the largest by far commercial beekeeper in the United States. And his name is Brett Addy. And he does pollination contracts for California and other places with apple orchards and other crops. But he would park those 92,000 hives on a 3,000 acre ranch, and then he overwinters them away from big ag and pesticides and anything that can harm them in areas that have a lot of water sources. And he would bring them out for pollination contracts. And he said that in his opinion, a lot of the issues were initially he thought that the issues were viruses, and he didn't believe in colony collapse, right, initially. And then he realized that his bees, he started losing them as well. And he came to the conclusion, as the largest beekeeper in the United States that knows his business and has 92,000 colonies he works with, so he has the stats and the understanding of the superorganism to go along with it. He came to the conclusion that basically the pesticides were probably what was killing his bees, and in more particular neonicotinoids. So I know this is a controversial subject, but there's a reason it's controversial. We have to remember that there's a lot of power players out there that are trying to control the narrative. So I'll leave it at that. But he ended up suing the EPA in 2016, and he and a group of other commercial beekeepers sued the EPA under the guise of EPA's actions and inactions have caused both acute honeybee kills and chronic effects leading to excessive bee colony mortality, bird mortality, nationwide water and soil contamination, and other environmental and economic harms. So that was his battle force.
And that is actually a very valid point. And we need people like that to stand up, that are the major players in the game, because there are far more beekeepers out there, even in just the United States, but across the world, than you would imagine. But the trick though is that there's more of us that have 1 or 2 hives than there are the gentleman that has 95,000.
There's like 99% of us that have bees. We just don't have the majority of the colonies. We have a small number.
And so therefore we have a small voice, whereas that one gentleman who provides, most of the pollination contracts to the country has a larger say and a larger voice. So we do need those individuals to stand up and be able to speak out against that stuff. But my own experience, and it doesn't mention this, it doesn't go into this in the article whatsoever, but my own experience though is that most of those commercial beekeepers, even though they may be fighting neonicotinoids and they may be, taking to task the major companies that produce these types of synthetic chemicals, still use synthetic chemicals to treat their bees for mites.
And that's what the article didn't say.
Yeah, and the article doesn't mention that, but it's one of those things that, does that not become a catch-22, or is that not in some way almost hypocritical to turn around and say, you have to stop using these chemicals on your fields and orchards because they're killing my bees, but I'm going to still put in amitraz, and possibly kill my bees because I'm trying to treat the mites. And that it is still a chemical that is absorbed into the wax and then can be leached back out and has effects on the bees. And that's one of the reasons that they tried to start moving away from those things. And they did create the organic treatments, but even the organic treatment is still something that we've talked about in the past. If you eat 1,000 bananas, you're going to die of cancer from bananas if you did it every day, kind of thing. So formic acid naturally occurring, but not in those levels, it would never be in that level and that concentration. Yeah.
Right. And that's the dose that makes the poison, right? We have also arsenic in honey. Do we treat
unfortunately, because it comes out of the pollution in the air, but
right. So I mean, at some point you got to ask yourself, you can poison yourself with water, right? And I think that number of organic treatments is actually organic acids. That's where it came from. But things like essential oils or all the acids, formic acids, oxalic acid, hop beta acids, all have concentrations that are potentially toxic to the bees, right? I can put some vinegar in my salad, but I'm not going to shower in battery acid, as my example, always, right? So you just kind of keep in mind that it always takes a toll on the colony. But beyond that, and that's again my own bias, but also you know, hopefully a way for people to think of it in other terms. Even if you believe in treating your bees, maybe I can plant a little seed and help you be mindful of the fact that anytime you help that colony, you're putting pressure on the pest, in this case the varroa mite, or anything else that is a pest of the colony, because you're afraid, and you're putting pressure on that mite, and you're not putting that pressure on the bees, because the very presence of those mites is putting a certain level of pressure on them to either find a way to live with them or get rid of them so that they don't get impacted. And by helping the bees, we're not affording them that evolutionary advantage that they can get really quickly in the grand scheme of things, because they have so many generations in a cycle of a year, that can happen a lot faster. We're thinking in terms of human beings, oh, it's going to take forever for us to evolve, but it takes a lot faster. It doesn't take as long for insects that have multiple generations over a season. And there's a lot of evidence out there that, you know, in Africa and in Jamaica and other countries that don't have the means to purchase those expensive treatments, they have gone around and gotten out of the problems with the varroa mites really quickly, in 3 to 5 years. And Les always says, you know, if we had stopped treating years ago, we would not be needing to treat anymore. This has been 30 years. The definition of insanity is keep doing the same thing and hope for different results, right? So, but you know, I mean, there's part of it that's bias. There's part of it that's experience with your own colonies. And then there's part of it that's research, more objective, with the understanding that research is not always necessarily objective because of the funding and the bias of the research, if we're going back to bias, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And, you know, we talk a lot about when it comes into mites and pesticides and treatment free, but there's other aspects of this that actually fall exactly in line with it that other beekeepers do. So one of these things is empathizing, or being able to walk a mile in somebody's shoes and at least understand maybe where they're coming from. So you may listen to one of the episodes and we're talking about something natural related, and you may not agree with how that goes. But at the same time, say, and it could be either way, say you do treat or you don't treat, but say you find a swarm really late in the season, and you catch that swarm, be it from your own colonies or out there in the wild, and you do everything possible to go through and raise that colony up because you want more bees.
That's right.
What you've just done has enabled a colony that in nature would have died.
That's right.
And you've allowed genetics and a habit, a genetic predisposition to swarm late in the year, which is not advantageous for the bees. If the bees swarm in August, it's maybe not great, but if they swarm in November, that colony was doomed. I don't care where you're at in the United States, they weren't probably going to make it, because most of the places don't have a flow at that point in time of the year. They've got to spend all the resources they took with them to draw wax, but then there's no food out there to fill that wax. And they're not going to have enough comb to raise enough bees to get a big enough cluster to survive the winter and regulate the heat. So that colony was doomed. They should have died, but you prevented them from dying because you wanted more bees. So you caught them, you fed them, you enabled them, you gave them more comb. You did everything against the nature of the bees.
Yes.
To create this colony that you desperately wanted. Now, maybe later that colony may fail, or maybe that colony does great, or maybe they do exactly what they did and how you got them. They create this genetic line that always wants to swarm late in the year. And now they're spreading those genetics to your other colonies as you're going through an interbreeding and mating. Even if you don't realize you're doing it, if you miss a swarm and they raise a new queen and she goes out and mates, she could very easily get some of these genetics and bring them back. And now it starts this other thing. So even if you are treating or are not treating, you are still making decisions, consciously or not, about the evolution of your bees in their lifetime. You do it when you pick the traits. I want to raise this colony because they're less defensive. I want to raise this colony because they produce more honey. So I'm going to raise queens off of those two colonies. You have made a choice and you're doing a genetic evolution there. So don't necessarily then turn around and be very pessimistic or biased towards somebody who says, I don't want to treat because I think they need to evolve. And you say, well, that's not that you shouldn't do that. That's not your choice. You're doing it as a beekeeper every day, but then you use it against somebody else because you don't agree with why they're doing it.
So that's a very good point. There, every time you do some selection for the bees, you might not be picking the right criteria and the right genetics to be propagated, whether you're selecting 4 aspects of anything, which in the end leads to inbreeding depression and the loss of hybrid vigor, or you're propagating those weak genetics, like you just very pertinently said, which in the end is bad in itself. But I think that you're right. We need to realize that when we do that, when we're wanting to make have all our dinks and poor colonies survive, because we don't want to have losses, we want to keep them alive, we want to have more bees, we're all addicts. Look, getting into beekeeping, you turn into an addict.
Welcome
sorry
to Beekeepers Anonymous.
Exactly.
My name's John. I have a problem.
I'm close to 250 now, and it's just kind of like, it just keeps going. It goes really crazy, really fast. But realizing that whatever your choice is has consequences, like you just said, matters. Because you might be treating and you might be, and I've done it, right? I've helped out colonies that were dinks and maybe would not have made it otherwise, without feeding them, sometimes I have fed them. That's another thing. You've helped them where, in the end, that was a swarm that was not meant to overwinter. But you're really making choices for the genetic pool. You're stacking the deck against natural evolution. You're stacking the deck against resiliency and just kind of strengthening the overall pool in your area.
Right.
And that's something that we need to be mindful of. And that speaks to the underlying perception of why we do what we do.
Right.
We need to have really good reasons, but step back a little bit and see the forest behind the tree, right?
Right. Because you again, consciously or unconsciously, made a choice that has now affected the genetic evolution of not just that colony, but the other colonies out there. And you may have done it out of greed and a hoarding sense of, I need more bees. You may have done it out of a sympathy or empathy of, oh my God, I love them so much, I don't want them to die. There could be any reason in there, but you have still altered the genetic course of that colony for better or worse. And a lot of times in that instance, for the worse. But so keep that in mind the next time you chastise somebody because they turn around and they say, I am trying to choose genetics that can fight this thing so that I don't have to treat and do these things. Well, you can't do that. You can't manipulate that. It's not right for you to choose, but you chose. You just didn't realize you were making that same type of choice. It was under a different circumstance.
And I love this discussion because I just realized that I do the same thing sometimes, right? I'm like, I want this colony to survive. I'm going to help it out. I'm not going to go as far as treating, but I'm doing the same thing. And this conversation is actually very interesting because it's making me think that, I was starting to think I don't need to feed colonies. I don't want to provide them with sugar syrup and all this stuff. And this is kind of comforting me in my instincts that, if they make it, they make it. And they'll be stronger for it. But I have to empathize with people that have 1 or 2 colonies.
Right, because if you've got 250 and you lose one, it's no big deal.
My position, that's right. I can make up the numbers. I don't lose that much because I'm experienced and whatever my practices work for us and our bees, and we don't push them for honey. So we're not looking at the same kind of, we're allowing them to do brood breaks and that's healthy for them. So our practices are helping us with what we're doing. So it has to work for you as well. But we have to be as bigger beekeeper mindful of the fact that some people don't have that luxury because they don't have the same number of bees or the same experience. There's the Dunning-Kruger effects. We were talking about that on that natural beekeeping corner, and it's basically the people in a nutshell. And James Lee might have an issue with my way to describe it, but in a nutshell, is people that don't know, that don't have the skills, have an overinflated estimation of their skill level, but they don't know what they don't know. And then on the flip side, you have people that are more experienced that will assume that everybody else has that common knowledge at the very basic level, but not everybody does. So when we have those conversations, we also need to be mindful about that bias, which this is what the Dunning-Kruger effect is. And we need to realize that we need to meet halfway. We need to take into account and empathize, like you were saying earlier, with what the other side is coming from, where they're coming from, what their biases are, what their knowledge level is, what their experience is, what their goals are. And it's never a black and white answer, and it shouldn't be a me versus you. It shouldn't be that tribal. My thinking personally is that a lot of actors in the field of beekeeping have a vested interest in beekeepers being tribal and fighting over those treatments versus no treatments, commercial versus, you know, small scale and backyard beekeepers, because that's kind of like throwing red herrings. And I mentioned that in the natural beekeeper corner, as it's distracting us. We're all busy in fighting, where big ag and pesticide companies are, you know, creating a lot of the problems that we're fighting over in the end. And the baromites, in my opinion, is just a symptom of an underlying problem that if we fix that, we're not going to have the problems that we do with the baromites, and we're not going to have to treat them as much, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Now that's an absolute perfect synopsis of that, you know, bringing that all together. So
I think we need to look at the bigger picture, is basically what I'm saying. And if we stop fighting and we take a step back and we don't judge others for what they believe, then we need to start seeing the solutions and what we need to do for the well-being of the bees. That's going to be good for commercial beekeepers. That's going to be good for backyard beekeepers. That's going to be good for everybody. Somebody said to me, the problem is, so there was a big discussion about commercial and all this stuff. And they were saying, well, we need the commercial beekeepers because without them, we are not going to have any food, right? And, but in a way, you know, and people are going to starve. And I'm like, well, maybe the system will adjust, right? There's a homeostasis where basically a balancing effect of things. If you have less food, you have fewer people anyway. Right?
I mean, ultimately that would be the scenario. Yeah. Over time, that's what will happen. That will balance out.
And the race forward to intensive agriculture, intensive this and that, it's only allowing more people. And when does it stop? Right. I mean, the resources on this planet are finite.
Well, the other part of that too is that it's backwards from the reality of it, is backwards from the way that it's presented. Oh, well, we you know, the beekeepers need to blah, 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 but the beekeepers are just trying to keep up. Like they aren't the ones that created the current agricultural wheel and cycle and how that goes. They are just desperately struggling to try and keep up. If it were up to them, they would not vote to triple the size of the almond orchards in California, because they already know it's not sustainable. Sustainable farming and sustainable living used to be localized, and it was community-based efforts and community-based things. You may have a couple of beekeepers in that community. You may have a couple of people that raise chickens, or everybody may have a mix of that. You've got a farm where you've got a couple of hives, you've got some hens and a rooster, you've got a couple of cows, you've got some goats, you got a pig, you know, whatever, and you grow some vegetables. Or maybe your neighbor grows vegetables and you do the husbandry over the animals, and then you all share and trade with each other so that it balances out. But we've taken all that away, and we have commercialized agriculture to this massive machine that just cannot be stopped. And when they do that, they go through and they say, we want this entire swath of country just to produce corn, and we want this swath of country just to produce wheat. when normally it would have been producing a variety of things throughout the seasons that would have sustained its local economy. But now it's not even going to the local economy. It's being shipped overseas, or it's being sent here. There's all these different things going on, and the beekeepers are literally just desperately trying to keep up. If the beekeepers all stopped, and I'm not saying that they should, but to go back to if there's not enough food, something's going to have to change. If the beekeepers all stopped, yes, it would put some pressure on everybody to try to rethink that. If an area cannot sustain millions of acres of orchards of a specific type of thing, then maybe that needs to be changed. But at this point, is there any turning or going back? Because so much has been invested in it, so much money is behind it, all those big behind the curtains names are involved in it in one way or another. Agriculture, pesticide, chemical companies, all of it is intertwined in there because they all feed off of each other,
That's right.
And so they're all behind there pushing that. So the unfortunate reality today, and I saw this whenever people started thinking that the bees were going to go extinct. That all started because there were a few species of bee, not honeybees, not Western or European honeybees, but of a bee that lived in Hawaii that was put onto the endangered species list.
Right.
That native bee caused this whole other thing where people were like, oh my God, the bees are going extinct. We've got to help. And there were some factions out there that instead of looking at how they could help the bee, started looking at how they could create other things to do the bee's job. You have miniature drones and robotics and things that can go out there and they can do all this pollination. So the reality is, even today, if every beekeeper in the world said, no, I'm not doing it anymore, I'm not taking my bees out there to pollinate your almonds, what would happen is the money would shift and they would come up with something to replace this. That's the scary truth of it.
So a lot of things to unpack here, because I love all those points. So the first point I would say, big commercial beekeepers at the time in 2017 were getting $200 per hive to pollinate almond orchards, right? And that's a lot of money. And they had to do that because money from honey was not profitable anymore because of the imports of fraudulent or honeys from all over the world that are not always honey. That could be rice syrup tasting like honey. That could be high fructose corn syrup tasting like honey. We talked about this a little bit, but it basically what it did is that it tanked the price of honey, meaning the beekeepers couldn't make enough money to make a living out of honey sales anymore. They switched over to pollination, and the big ag started increasing the prices to entice them to do that. And the other thing that article was talking about is the almond orchards used to flood the almond fields with warm water to prevent frosts of the budding trees. And because water is so expensive, especially in California, and this becoming a scarce resource in itself, and it's not really very efficient to do it that way, they ended up getting rid of all the underlying, weeds and everything that were part of the biodiversity and the ecosystem that was functioning in a healthy loop. And because those were trapping cold air and contributing to almond orchards freezing, so they decided to put all those herbicides, all those fungicides, all these things, and that's what ended up being so toxic to the bees, right? There's a lot of pollinators. It's not just the bees. The other thing that you were mentioning is that's whole save the bees kind of a thing, the hashtag save the bees, right? Really, the honeybees, we can, there's so many ways that as beekeepers we can help them. And yes, there's been losses, but there's also a mindfulness about the fact that there's native bees that are competing with the honeybees, and they're often like the rusty rusty patch bumblebee. Yeah. That's the one that's basically on the list of endangered species. There's a lot of other native bees and more solitary, less used social bees that are struggling. Pollinators of all kinds, butterflies, all kinds of things that are happening because we're poisoning our environment. Monoculture. So what happens with monoculture is that you have pests of soybeans and corn. And because we're packing those humongous fields full of the same crop and we're not rotating those, we're creating massive pest infestations at time, which require those pesticides to keep them crops alive. So there's a couple of things, a couple authors I wanted to mention. The first one is Richard Louv, L-O-U-V. He wrote a book called The Last Child in the Woods, and a bunch of other books about how we can revert to nature. And like you were saying, instead of relying on the importation and transportation of crops, we can grow them locally. We can start going back to some of that nature and do some of these things ourselves. That's why I highly believe in the top of Hive and keeping beehives, even on small areas, for people to grow their own honey, have the control of what's in their hive and in their honey, and just kind of bypass, pollinate your garden and grow your own food. It's going to be more, it's going to yield more with your own bees in the area, right? So all this stuff is kind of a loop that we need to keep in mind. The other author, it's a researcher that used to work for the USDA, I think. But anyway, his name is Jonathan Lundgren, and he's talking about that rotation of the crops instead of keeping that huge big ag monoculture thing. That's still feasible. That's something we could do. The problem is that just like you have the Walmarts and the Amazons that are absorbing the local businesses that are smaller, which cannot make a living anymore with the current prices for their products, like the smaller scale commercial beekeepers that were absorbed by Mr. AD himself, right? Or other bigger commercial. There's what do you call that? A concentration? No, it's a consolidation. There's more and more of the bigger actors and less of the smaller ones as they're getting swallowed by the bigger actors. It's true across the board. It's true in retail, it's true in agriculture, it's true in beekeeping. And I think that's what's causing. Are you hearing little chicks?
There was a screech in the background. I was like, what was that?
John has chicks that he's raising for the season. The studio. Yeah. And even though he's got a really good microphone, I think he's getting distracted by the
that one was loud. That was like somebody snatched it up off the ground or something. Like it screamed. That's why I was like, what the heck? Sorry. That was total derailment of train of thought.
That's funny. He just fed them before the call, and he says, well, maybe I should have done that afterwards. They're getting really excited.
Yeah, they were really, really happy, but I don't know what that was. I think one of them must have jumped on the other one's head or something. There was like,
oh my, yeah,
it was a scream.
Bloody murder. So no, anyway, there's a lot to unpack. There's a lot of considerations. It's not a black and white kind of a problem, but it's just, there's a lot of people that can think about this. That's not just the commercial beekeepers. That's not just the backyard beekeepers. If we all put our heads together, we're all smart people. We're doing beekeeping. It's a tough one, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm a firm believer that beekeepers are smart people, because otherwise they wouldn't be beekeepers anymore. They get out of it, right? Well, at least I would say
I was
3 years into it, 4 years into it. If you have done it for 3-4 years, and if you've been successful and you've stuck with it, then you're smart beekeeper.
I was going to bring up the conversation about the barber and
I love that conversation.
Used to have hives, but doesn't, because they all died. And my synopsis was he didn't know anything about anything that came out of his mouth. So that kind of went hand in hand with what you were saying. If you know what you're talking about and you're a good beekeeper, then you'll still be a beekeeper.
Right. So that's that magic 3 years into it. If you're still a beekeeper after that, then you've figured it out. If not, you're not really a beekeeper.
So one of the things that if for the listeners, if you are more interested in like the agricultural aspect of it, that you can do, if you have not already, Ken and I like gushed about this a couple of years ago whenever it first came out, but go out there and watch the movie The Pollinators, the documentary, because not only does it talk about honeybees, obviously, but it goes really in depth to sustainable farming, rotating crops, the difference in dead soil versus live soil that has lots of microbes and roots and worms and things in it versus just this hard chunk rock of dirt. It talks about it talks about rotating the crops. It talks about going through and putting in, like, if there's a specific pest that I don't remember how they specifically did it. It was like there was a type of squash beetle that would cause havoc, but that squash beetle was very, very, very preferential towards a specific plant. So they would plant one row of that plant as a sacrificial offering.
Yeah, like the drone brood.
Exactly, like us using drone brood comb to attract mites. They would attract all the pests to that row, and then if they needed to do something, they could deal with just that row, and they weren't treating everything else, or they weren't worrying about the pests spreading to the other stuff because they had the food they really preferred, and they left the other crops the farmer was actually trying to grow alone.
There you
So
go.
there's ways that you can go through and you can do that. So definitely check out the Pollinators documentary if you have not done so.
That's
But
great.
above and beyond all of that, the whole thing though with today is try not to have knee-jerk reactions. Try to stop and think logically through different scenarios, and try to put yourself in the place or the mindset or the situation of some of your fellow beekeepers before you judge them or before you criticize them. Especially, you know, if you have the urge to criticize them on social media, just turn it off, walk away, just don't do it. Like that's never the answer. So, you know, we need to try to be a better community amongst ourselves. And as you and Les say, we all rise together. So
right. And then there's something else, is that if we're all very tribal and very black and white, and we think we're right and they're wrong, we cannot hear each other. If we are trying to talk to people and share our ideas and maybe kind of meet halfway in some instances, then it behooves us to just kind of not be confrontational or very emotional about things. It behooves us to be informed, do our research, listen to what the other side is saying, and just kind of take it into account. It's not necessarily, you know, oh, that's complete hogwash because it's not jiving with my ideas. You can still think about it. You can still listen to it. And just, you know, don't get sucked into the big emotional fights. It's only going to serve as entrenching the people on both sides. It doesn't work if you're trying to spread a message or be heard yourself. You also have to hear the others and what they're saying.
absolutely. So I think that's a kind of a perfect wrap up and scenario there on all of this. So thank you everybody for bearing with us on this discussion and this topic of bias. And hopefully, you know, you don't have to agree with everything that we said, but at least you listen through all the way to the end, and maybe you can take some of those and think about them and see if any of that applies to you, and maybe ways that you can improve yourself or your beekeeping. And that's kind of what it's all about. So we really appreciate it, and we look forward to talking to you again next week. But until then, be good.
Be mindful.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
This Hive Jive production was made possible by amazing patrons like you, and we appreciate your support. To all our Hive Jive junkies out there, you truly are the bee's knees.